welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello, and welcome to the 12th episode of Punishment and Profit, an educational webinar series about the prison industry presented by Worth Rises and the Green Space. I'm Bianca Tylik, founder and executive director at Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of those it touches. Today, we're talking about transportation, from passenger vans to buses to planes that carry people for extradition, facility transfers, or deportation. Before we get into tonight's program, let's learn 5 quick facts about the transportation sector to ground us.
Imagine sitting in the back of a passenger van, handcuffed for 2 weeks. My name is Bianca Tylik. I'm the executive director at Worth Rises, and here are 5 facts you should know about transportation in the prison industry. Paid per person per mile, correctional transportation corporations routinely overcrowd vans, take extended routes, and avoid stops for food, bathrooms, or medical emergencies. Correctional institutions pay more than $90 million each year for an estimated 500 million extradition trips. Since 2000, at least 14 women have been sexually assaulted by staff, some repeatedly, while caged in prison transportation vans. Immigrants are also forced onto vans, buses, and planes for deportation, and if they refuse, can be tasered, put in body bags, and thrown on. 2019, ICE spent over $500 million to deport 250,000 people, including asylum seekers. Learn more with the curriculum at worthrises.org.
A little later in the show, we'll be talking to Victoria Maxwell, Alicia Santo, and Eli Hager. But first, I'd like to introduce Joseph de la Luz. Joseph works as a credible messenger, mentor, speaker with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, a faith-based organization working to end state-sponsored torture, including solitary confinement. Joseph has led discussions at local and national conferences, universities, and public rallies on the issue of solitary confinement. In 2014, Joseph was detained and deported from New York to Florida by a private transportation corporation. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you for having me. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. So some years ago, you were stopped by the police in New York and detained for an outstanding warrant in Florida. You waited 45 days for someone from the Orange County Sheriff's Department to come get you. It was 2 armed men in plain clothes. What went through your mind? Did you know who they were? Did they tell you who they were?
I mean, initially, the first thing that went through my mind, it was a shock. You know what I mean? I was expecting to go home on that day, and then to hear that I was being turned over to some gentlemen that I didn't know. They didn't identify themselves as just actually turn around and put handcuffs on me. I mean, so I was just initially shocked. I was scared. I was nervous. It was a lot of emotions at that time.
My understanding, you had been already waiting essentially 45 days for them to show up. Can you explain kind of what happened, how you got to that situation?
Yeah, initially it was 11 days, and then they actually asked for 2 more extensions, which led me up to the 45 days. I was supposed to be released on the 45th day, but they turned me over inside of the court to Orange County.
So here you were being whisked away by 2 random men. They brought you to the airport to take a commercial flight to Florida. That means a flight with other people, obviously. Can you explain what the airport and flight experience was like and what sticks with you most today?
Well, the airport experience was it was it was traumatizing. It definitely sticks with me till this day. Walking past the metal detectors, I had everybody staring at me. I was escorted. I was shackled. I had a taser like strapped to my bicep. Um, I was put on the plane first in front of everyone, and I was taken off at the end. Everybody was just staring. Kids, everybody was just staring at me. It was just, and I didn't know what was going on. It was my first time ever like going through anything like this. It was just a big shock for me.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And when you arrived, like at the airport in Florida, right? Like actually, backtrack for 1 second. I remember you told me something about how they had you sort of in the airport, right? There was something about a taser
Yeah, the
situation.
jackal.
Yeah, the
The
jackal.
jackal.
Can you explain to people?
Yeah,
what
it's
exactly
the
happened?
jackal is like this. It's like a huge phone that they strap like a Velcro to your arm, and the cop just told me, "Don't go too far, or you're gonna find out how many voltage it is." That's literally all he said to me. So I was just following him around the whole time, nervous. I didn't know what was going on.
So they essentially had you on a shock device while you were walking through the airport.
Yeah, and I was also shackled. I had my arms and my waist shackled together as well.
So when you arrived at the airport in Florida, what happened?
I was two police officers come out of nowhere, and I was surprised. I thought I was under Orange County like jurisdiction the entire time, but then they just handed me over to Orange County Police Department, and that's when I realized I wasn't even with the police the whole time. I don't know who I was with.
Well, so that was the first moment you realized that you weren't actually in police custody. You were in the custody of God knows who.
Yeah, of course, because when they handed me over, I seen uniformed police officers. I was like, wait a minute, it doesn't make any sense. They changed my handcuffs out and then put me in a marked vehicle to take me to the jail.
And where'd the two men go that you had just been with for hours?
I have no idea. They literally turned around, got in their vehicle, and just disappeared.
Wow. So from there, you went to the Orange County lockup and you were locked up for what I understand was 8 to 9 months before you even saw a judge.
Yes.
Why
Correct.
did Florida extradite you? And what did the judge do when you saw them?
Well, they extradited me because they said I violated my conditional release by leaving the state of Florida. They wanted me to, after I served my sentence in Florida, to stay in the state for a year. And I wasn't aware of that. I didn't live in Florida, so I came back home. And of course, they extradited me back. And I thought it was crazy. After 8.5, 9 months of just sitting there, I go in front of the judge, and it's probably like a 5-minute court session. He tells me, okay, how long have you been in jail? Okay, you're released. And they just literally take me back, release me. I have no money, no clothing. My clothing was the same clothing that was in a bag for the last 8.5 months. I mean, I had no contact with anybody. They just literally just released me.
So, in other words, you were extradited, you were picked up on the street in New York for no violations or warrants in New York. You had a warrant in Florida and you were extradited to Florida by some strangers and with a taser on your arm or a shock device. You get to Florida and they lock you up before you can actually see a judge. You wait there and you find out the reason you've been extradited is because you left the state too early after already having served your sentence in Florida. You didn't know that that was the case. And then the judge just releases you again and says, what, you have to stay a few more months in Florida, but you're free to go?
Yeah.
Nothing. And now I don't even know how many thousands of miles from home.
Yeah, that's literally how it went. And then even after I was released, after the 8.5, 9 months, I still had 2 more months to do on the conditional discharge. So I wasn't even able to leave the state after that. So I was just stuck in Florida, had to figure it out from there. I had to work temp services and then they finally, after the 2 months, I finally jumped on a Greyhound bus and came back home to New York.
So you went there on a plane and you came back on a Greyhound bus.
Yeah, definitely did.
So, if there's one thing that you wish folks would take away from sort of your experience. And, we're going to talk more, for example, as you know, about other extraditions later in the show, specifically about those who, been extradited across these really awful vans for days and weeks. Your extradition, in some people's eyes may seem like, oh, it was a flight in a few hours. What would you want people to take away about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, it was a flight. It was only a couple of hours, but I was shackled. I was humiliated. I was embarrassed. I still have issues that I deal with because of this. I served my time. You know what I mean? When I look back at it now, I realize that I was kidnapped. I was taken against my will, put on an airplane and shipped to Florida. You know what I mean? And I want people to understand that that's not how you treat people,
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for sharing your experience. We're gonna bring you back, and we look forward to talking to you and doing some Q&A towards the end of the show.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, and I'll see you then. Thank you.
Of course. A quick reminder that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to use the chat function to pose questions to any of our guests. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. Our next guest is Victoria Maxwell. Victoria is a current PhD student in security studies. Previously, Victoria worked as a victims advocate, youth corrections officer, and dispatcher for privatized prison transportation. After leaving her role as a dispatcher, Victoria began to support victims in litigation against prison transportation corporations, pulling back the veil on the opaque sector as what some may call a whistleblower. Victoria, thank you so much for joining us. So I want to start by acknowledging that you are the only guest speaker we have had on Punishment and Profit series who formerly worked in the prison industry. But you bring an important perspective today as someone who also came around to now serving as an advocate against it. You have a perspective that most others don't have. So let's just start there. In your time working for a prison transportation corporation that provided extradition services to prisons and jails across the country, you saw all sorts of terrors. Can you walk us through some of the things you witnessed, from the maintenance of vans to the treatment of passengers?
So definitely the big thing was these vans. They were basically just converted transit vans that had what was called a dog cage inside that was retrofitted. They were basically maintained by mom and pop shops that had no experience dealing with correctional and state vehicles. And these things were run into the ground. So our officers are calling us saying, hey, our van has threadbare tires. What would you like us to do? And they'd basically be told to keep driving, which led to so many accidents because these vans were completely run down vehicles. And they were usually bought used, so they weren't even new, and then retrofitted for these purposes. They were basically treated like cattle being put into these vans, and with very little consideration for the fact that these are humans that are being transported.
And can you say a little bit more about that? Like when you say that, these corporations treated your employer, treated people like cattle, and didn't have consideration for what that means. What did that mean? Like, what did that mean inside? What was a trip inside one of these vans like?
It came down to if they needed medical care, they tried everything in their possible power to avoid being the medical providers. They would have to sign a waiver stating that they accept all responsibility, even if they got injured on the van. And it was a negotiation just to get our bosses to approve hospital runs. This was essentially, they were ushered in shackles and given food at any stop at some point, no idea when. And they could be in these vans for an upward of 2 weeks. We had one person that was on there for almost a month in one van, being extradited from one county to another that did the most roundabout route there was no need. And, they're basically looked at as numbers.
How does one survive weeks, almost a month on a van like that? I mean, there's no bathrooms, right? There's no bathrooms, there's no showers, there's no, food, I guess, is you're pretty much at the behest of the driver, like sleeping in a seated upright van, for a month, like.
Yeah, it was rough on both the passengers and the drivers because they're basically just having to go from jail stop to jail stop, and that's the only opportunity to use a bathroom. That's the only opportunity to get out and stretch your legs because the drivers can't leave the van unsecured, and obviously they're not going to let the passengers out at a normal stop, so they have to be only in a secure facility in order for them to do anything.
Wow, so they really just went and used the restroom and had stops at one facility or another. It was like hopscotch. So in our conversation, Victoria, you mentioned that it wasn't just that the corporations engaged in many of these unethical practices that left people in harm's way, but that you routinely saw your employer engage in illegal behavior. What were some of those things that you saw? And did you ever refuse to participate or report behavior? And if so, what happened?
There was daily practice of altering documents, extradition orders that would come in. They would have to be cleaned up to look like original documents. And these were given to federal facilities. I mean, it was insane.
So back up for 1 second for our audience. What is the process by which somebody gets extradited? What's this piece of paper that is even being doctored? Why does it need to be handed over and to whom?
So basically, whoever the prosecution is going to have to go for an extradition order through a judge. The judge is going to be the one that's going to grant this extradition order. Then these institutions will reach out to these transportation companies and basically say, hey, we have this extradition order. Here's the paperwork. Can you move this person for us? And most of the time it's just crappy photocopied, documents that are sent to us that aren't even the originals. Sometimes they're missing signatures that we can't then go get. And then
missing signature seems pretty important.
Was that?
A missing signature seems pretty important.
Yes, it is. It's extremely important.
Kind of the point.
And I was one of the ones that generally would say, no, we're not turning this in. I don't even care. I'm not trying to get in that kind of trouble of actually forging signatures. That's not happening. But so then eventually our officers would have to take in this paperwork to whatever the pickup facility was going to be. And then they process it and release that person into the custody of those officers.
I see. And so what you're saying is that in many cases, when some of these papers didn't have signatures or or there were other missing pieces, the people at the corporation would actually forge some of those papers in order to get that contract and hand that over to, let's say, the Federal Bureau of Prisons?
It would be more of an altered document. I'm not going to say necessarily forged. We didn't go write signatures in. That, at least not while I was there.
Yeah.
That never happened. But they would do everything in their power to make this document look like the original document that should have been given to the officers directly by the facility instead of a photocopy.
See. So eventually you left and you started to support victims and their families in litigation against these transportation industries. How were you helping in these cases and why was it so important to you? Was there any part of you that was sort of atoning for having been a part of the industry and the harm in the first place?
So it mostly started with a recent lawsuit against my former employer by a person that was battered during the run. And I mean, they sustained terrible, terrible injuries. I was subpoenaed actually as a witness for the defense for this lawsuit. And I just couldn't bring myself to give in to the prep of the defense of saying, we want you to be careful about what you talk about. And I'm like, no, this is a court of law, first off. And second off, I'm going to be honest. If they ask me these questions, I'm going to answer them honestly, and I'm not going to omit anything, because what happened to this person, somebody needs to be held accountable for. And, yes, there is some definitely atonement on my part, having been a party to a lot of this, and just wanting to make sure that I'm making sure people get the justice that they deserve.
Yeah, I mean, when you were still in the corporation, did you ever try to report anything, and what were the reactions that you got?
We actually had an incident in Washington, D.C., where similar to Joseph's situation, he was about to be released, and our officers were running late. And I got a call from the judge's office saying, hey, we're releasing him because you guys aren't here at the deadline. And at that point, that extradition order is no longer valid. It has to be re-signed by another judge stating that they can do this extradition because that one is expired. And I told my boss, this is what happened. And he said, pick him up off the street. And I said, no, that's not happening. That's essentially kidnapping. And he said, we have the extradition order, pick him up off the street. I was like, well, the extradition order is not valid anymore. It doesn't have to be re-signed by a judge. And he goes, no, there's a law that we can do this because we have the paperwork. And our officers called and said, what do we do? And I said, do what's in your best judgment. And eventually my boss talked to them and said, no, you're going to pick this person up. And so they did. And I ran it up the chain, and I was basically told, it's not a problem. This is a huge problem, because I don't want to be held liable for somebody being kidnapped, and nor should that ever be happening. So we need to be, if we're going to be doing these sorts of transportations, we need to be following the extradition orders. We need to be following the law with it. And there was just such blatant disregard for what that meant.
So given your inside view, right, having seen everything that you saw and how this, this corporation, the industry sort of even larger worked, how would you describe the importance of ending the prison industry, and why is it integral to the abolition of prisons and jails?
So having worked both in the public government side of prisons as well as in the private side, it's such a broken system. And there's so many people that are being treated so poorly that haven't even seen a judge yet, that haven't even gone to trial, that we haven't even determined are guilty or innocent. And it's atrocious because these people are being treated in such an inhumane way, and the system is constantly perpetuating this. So to me, it needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed radically.
Victoria, thank you so much for your time. We will see you at the end of the show. Our final guests today are Alicia Santo and Eli Hager. Alicia is a reporter for the Marshall Project. Her investigative reporting on the criminal justice system has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, and elsewhere. She was a finalist for the 2021 Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting for reporting on Mississippi's prison system. She was also a finalist for the Livingston Award in both 2016 and 2017, and a runner-up for the John Jay College H.F. Guggenheim Prize for Excellence in Criminal Justice Reporting in 2017 and 2019. Welcome, Alicia. Eli is a staff writer at the Marshall Project covering juvenile justice, family court, fines and fees, and other issues. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and The Guardian, as well as This American Life and many other places. He also edits the Marshall Project's Life Inside series of essays by incarcerated writers. In 2017, Eli was named a Livingston Award finalist for his investigation into privatized prison transportation. Together, Alicia and Eli have reported extensively on the U.S. private extradition business, authoring a series of articles for the Marshall Project. Thank you so much both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So, Alicia, let me start with you.
Sure.
Can you help us understand the historical context or how we got here, right? We heard the personal story of Joseph. We heard sort of the inside take, right, that Victoria had through her experience there. But how did we get to this place in the first place? How did private extradition business, the business start, and how has it changed over time?
So as the prison population in America grew, jail populations grew, this industry came in basically to replace what had previously been the public transport of people, extradition of people, which would typically involve a local officer who would drive states away to pick someone up and bring them to the jurisdiction where they were facing charges. Which obviously isn't a small undertaking, particularly over long distances. So as the volume of that kind of transportation need grew, and these transport companies were established and offered this very cheap alternative to traditional extradition. And over time, the industry's consolidated to the point where there's one large company, Prisoner Transportation Services, which has over more recent years acquired its competition and is really the only major player at this point in the extradition business.
So, Eli, let me turn to you and ask about the business model in this sector. Joseph told us earlier about being extradited by plane, but as I understand it, most people are extradited in passenger vans across many states. Can you tell us about the business model in this space that's utilized by Prisoner Transportation Services, the corporation that Alicia mentioned, and maybe any others that are flying?
Definitely, yeah. As you say, it's mostly vans that are transporting people. These companies do use planes in certain circumstances, and they have a little bit done that during the pandemic. But it's mostly vans, and the only way that they're able to make a profit is by cutting corners. So that explains a lot of the problems that other folks have talked about today. So for example, the reason why there are a lot of crashes on these vans is because they're paid by the mile. So they're driving really fast. They're driving at all hours of the night. They're driving for weeks on end. And that obviously leads to crashes. The reason why, or one of the reasons why there are medical emergencies on these vans is because, again, they're paid by the mile, by the person that they can cram onto the van. So they really don't want to stop. So if somebody has, withdrawal from a medication or is diabetic or has some other reason that they need to stop and go to a hospital, they just don't stop. They just keep going. And this leads to medical emergencies. And in several instances, people have died. So I just say all of that by way of saying that the only way to actually make a profit in this industry is to really cram these vans with as many people as possible, go on very circuitous routes across the country, and drive at all hours of the night for weeks on end. And that's how you really rack up enough money to survive in this industry, which, as Alicia said, only PTS has really been able to do. And they've, to a certain extent, monopolize their competition, some of these smaller companies that used to exist.
So I think this whole idea, right, of driving being paid per person per mile is pretty remarkable business model that, as you said, incentivizes a lot of the wrong behavior, like not stopping for, I guess, any kind of needs, really. In this particular example, or in this way, doesn't that also deflect sort of the needs of even some of the jails, right? Like, you don't get people in any due amount of time.
I think I see what you're saying. I mean, one of the things that that enables this business model is just the fact that so many of these local jurisdictions, whether it's jails or police departments or sheriff's offices or district attorneys, they just want to go find people who have outstanding warrants, and they they don't want to drop these warrants and they want to pick them up. And so they're paying this company to go all across the country to pick up these people for what are often very minor charges. And so the underlying fact beneath this business model is just the size of the criminal justice system, how many people are being arrested and how many people are wanted on warrants and how many people are being picked up. That makes it, if the criminal justice system is going to remain that vast, it makes it necessary for these local jurisdictions to hire private companies with a bad record in terms of how they treat people on their vehicles.
Right. I mean, I think the bottom line is, as you're saying, like a lot of times these are things for very petty reasons that they're being extradited, right? Like none of this is clearly urgent, and incentivizes all this wrong behavior. So transportation in the prison industry is often not a topic that many journalists write about. In fact, there's remarkably little written about this space, and most of it is from your journalism together. So this question is for the both of you. What was it about this space that made you feel like it needed your attention? What were the one or two stories you heard that made you get together and say people need to know? And Alicia, why don't we start with you?
Our first story in particular about prison transport started with, we were looking into the case of a man named Stephen Gallick, who had died under mysterious circumstances while being transported from Florida to Ohio to face a charge of not paying child support. We looked at the lawsuit and we started tracking down, route logs and gas receipts and just every piece of documentation we could gather, and realized that there were a lot of lawsuits actually against these companies. And from there, we just built as much reporting as we could, documenting every company that existed, every lawsuit that existed, every Department of Transportation fine or fee that was ever issued to one of these companies. And I mean, we were drawn to this because of what was occurring on these vans and just the lack of any reporting really previously that had existed on the subject, despite the very dire consequences people were facing when they were put on to the vans. And, we found actually lots of former employees willing to talk to us about it as well. A lot of times in law enforcement, when you have to talk to law enforcement for stories, it's really difficult. In this case, we had a lot of people willing to talk to us because they were quite disturbed by what they've been asked to do as employees. So yeah, we made it our goal to just find out what was this industry, who operates it, who uses it, and document the harms that it had caused for people.
Thank you, Alicia. And I'll say then, I think given that so many people from the industry were interested in speaking, and I'm glad we have Victoria here, this was a more common narrative. Eli.
Yeah, I would echo what Alicia said. I mean, as journalists, when we see that something hasn't been covered, that makes us want to cover it. So when we saw that, as Alicia said, we learned about the Stephen Gallick case, and then we just saw just how many lawsuit upon lawsuit, and then we looked at local news clips, and there was just so many crashes of these vehicles and so many escapes from these vans. And then we also started finding out about people who had died on these vans. And then in the process of contacting all of those people who had been part of those experiences, hearing about the conditions on the vans, from, not being able to go to the bathroom, so having to do that on the van, to not having seatbelts, to men and women together being seated together, leading to sexual assaults. We just thought this whole network of vehicles crisscrossing the country on our highways that most people don't know about and don't know what's going on inside of the vehicles. And at the Marshall Project, that's what we try to do, is to shine a light on things that are happening to people, some of whom may have made a mistake, some of whom may have not, but either way, shouldn't be treated like that. And we wanted to describe what the conditions were on those vans. So that's what required the reporting.
So unsurprisingly, because of exactly what you're saying, which so few people were writing about this, knew anything about this, it's also a really unregulated space and a place where not a lot of advocacy and activism and work has been done. So Alicia, in the reporting that you all did, you uncovered that there's really only one piece of legislation that is regulating the space, and that it's barely doing so. Can you tell us a bit about Jenna's Act, why it was introduced, is it working, and why it's not enough?
So Jenna's Act came after an incident in 1999 when a man who had been convicted of killing an 11-year-old girl escaped from a private transport van. His absence wasn't noticed for 9 hours. Law enforcement wasn't informed for several hours. It was featured on America's Most Wanted. So it was a big story at that time. After it happened, a U.S. Senator from North Dakota introduced Jenna's Act, which passed in 2000. And not surprisingly, the circumstances that led to it influenced the legislation, which is that Jenna's Act largely focused on preventing escapes. It mandates that extradition companies must notify law enforcement immediately after an escape. People on board have to be dressed in brightly colored clothing. There has to be one guard for every 6 people on board. And it sets some broad standards for training and background checks of officers that are driving the vans, and some broad standards for the treatment of people on board. But it's very vague on those types of concerns. Again, it's mostly focused on preventing escapes. It's also, from what we could tell, only been enforced one time. We were able to find one instance in 2011 where someone escaped from an unlocked van in North Dakota. And basically that company that was responsible for that escape was fined $80,000 and went out of business. Other than that, we were not able to find enforcement of Jenna's Act at any other time.
Wow, one time is quite a number. But I think, the important part is that Jenna's Act does nothing to actually protect the people who are riding in these vans. And as we learned earlier from Eli, in most cases, right, we are talking about really, really awful conditions from Eli and from Victoria, awful conditions, in many cases for incredibly, incredibly petty reasons that people are being extradited. Though obviously, no matter what the reason, critical that we treat people like people. So Eli, I'm coming back to you. That begs the question, what needs to be done? What is it in your view that needs to happen to stop PTS, the Prison Transportation Services, and the other smaller transportation corporations in space from these remarkably unethical and dangerous practices in order to save lives?
Well, both because I'm just a journalist reporting on what the conditions are, more so than an advocate, and also because I can't say for sure what should be done. But I will say that I can talk about some of the things that have been attempted after we published our first investigation of this industry. The Justice Department under then President Obama promised Congress that they would start an investigation of the industry, and there was some indication that investigation did start. They contacted a few people who had been who had experienced these conditions on these vans, and they subpoenaed or they requested documents from PTS and that kind of thing. And Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren wrote letters to PTS also asking for information. The problem with that is that investigation fizzled to a certain extent when the Justice Department changed hands in 2017. And then without federal oversight, you're left with this kind of vacuum because these vans are constantly crossing state and jurisdictional lines. So the county that sends the person denies responsibility for what happens to them on the van because they say that that person is no longer in their custody, and the county or jurisdiction that's receiving, so to speak, the person also denies responsibility for what happens because the person is not there yet. And so it's this kind of gray zone that requires federal oversight. And as Alicia said, the one law that provides federal oversight has only been enforced once. So it would require either a continuation of the federal civil rights investigation that began, but that was halted. Or it would require, as I kind of alluded to earlier in my other answer, it would require local agencies to make different decisions about the scope of who really needs to be extradited. I mean, if they're going to continue to go seek out somebody, if they're a sheriff's office in Florida and they're going to continue to seek out somebody in Utah who's wanted on an outstanding child support warrant or something like that, then they're probably going to continue to use these companies because it's not cost effective for them to send two sheriff's deputies all the way to Utah to go pick up that person. So I guess I would return to the point that it's about kind of how much our public agencies want to arrest and incarcerate and pursue people as much as anything else.
I think that's an important point, and also brings me back to, I think, a point that was made in one of your stories once, that one of these companies actually did kill somebody in their custody and yet still issued a invoice to the extraditing county. Is that right? I mean, because that, for me, that like brings back to this point that you're making about how, for them, it's the dollars and cents about them like staying alive as these extradition companies, and the cost is so minor to the counties at that point as compared to what it would cost them to do this. And so it's easy for them to keep, in all these cases, extraditing for remarkably petty things.
Yeah, that's correct. That's the case of Stephen Gallick, who Alicia mentioned earlier. He was being extradited from Florida to Ohio. He was being taken on a very circuitous route, was experiencing medical problems, and also faced injuries as a result of how he was treated by the other people on the van, and died while only in I think it was Tennessee, although there's some dispute about which state he was in when he actually died. In any event, he only made it halfway to Ohio, but PTS still sent an invoice to the county in Ohio where he was headed to ask them to pay for his transport.
Yeah, wow. Alicia and Eli, thank you so much. To keep up with Alicia and Eli's work, please visit their respective author pages at the Marshall Project. We'd like to remind everyone that you can share questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or by using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit on Twitter. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. But before we jump into Q&A, here are my takeaways from this week's discussion about transportation. It's wild to think that every year there are 500,000 people dangerously extradited across jurisdictional lines all over the country for nothing more than outstanding child support, as was mentioned, or in Joseph's case, technical parole violation. In some cases, people are quite literally kidnapped by other private citizens carrying meaningless badges, but also armed with guns. People are handed over to the custody of others based on little more than an unvalidated piece of paper. They are then forced to sit in the back of a van for days or weeks, shackled and chained, their humanity degraded mile by mile as their captors profit. And yet we learn that it doesn't take days or weeks to irreparably traumatize somebody. Damage can be done in just a few hours, as Joseph explained. And then there are others who we never hear from. Today, we didn't get to talk about perhaps the most expansive prison transportation enterprise in the country, the deportation machine. Every year, ICE spends more than $500 million to deport more than 250,000 people, including asylum seekers fleeing dangerous situations in their homelands. Officers unabashedly taser immigrants protesting to go and throw them onto planes in shackles in body bags. And their stories really rarely make it back because those folks aren't here to tell them. Some years ago, my 15-year-old cousin was one of those deported. My dear cousin took a train to Miami to meet and retrieve our aunt. He was stopped by ICE agents on the train and shortly after called from a detention center. He was too young to fight his deportation. We didn't want him to, sitting in a detention center down in the South, and it was just all too traumatic for him, for the family, and we had a loving grandmother. He was shipped off back to our motherland in Ecuador, knowing that he wouldn't see his family for at least a decade at just 15 years old. His brother got married a few years later, and Santi called into the wedding as the best man, and that was hard. Tears filled the eyes of many of us in the banquet hall that day as we watched him give his best man speech from a lot of miles away. Today, I remember that someone made $1 of us $500 million, and they continue to do that off families. Now let's bring back some of our guests to answer your questions. Hello. So joining us back, we're going to hop into some of the questions that we have. And the first question I have, which may be answered by probably Alicia or Eli, maybe Victoria may know as well, but in these cases where litigation has actually been brought against one of these extradition companies, how successful are these cases and what is typically the result? Have there actually been either civil lawsuits that have returned anything, or are these typically unsuccessful?
There have been, as we described, there have been almost endless number of civil lawsuits. A lot of them are successful in terms of describing the individual harm to the individual plaintiff, but the few attempts that there have been to bring kind of a class action lawsuit describing how these practices harm whole groups of people have seen less success. And one other thing to note about the lawsuits is in one of our recent stories, we noted that some companies essentially change their name and maybe the official headquarters of their business and reincorporate, but they're the same company for all intents and purposes. They have the same managers and the same equipment and so on, but they do that to avoid accountability when they've been sued. And this has happened a number of times with some of these smaller companies. They just kind of they face a lawsuit and then they name themselves something else and carry on.
Yeah, I've definitely seen quite a bit of that. Victoria, for you, this next question. Did you encounter other dispatchers who were similarly troubled by what they were being asked to do, or were your coworkers simply responding to the orders that they were given?
Definitely my fellow coworkers were bothered. The work environment that we were in, though, was so hostile from our management that everybody was honestly scared to speak up and say anything. I wasn't able to do this until after I had left, which I ended up being laid off. That was the only way to leave in a manner that allowed me to be able to speak out. So definitely there is still a lot of people within the system that are extremely bothered by what they see and what's going on, that are just too scared to be able to do anything about it.
Thank you. Joseph, the next question is for you. This question comes in and says, Joseph, could you explain more about the shock device that was strapped to your arm? What was the purpose of this device? Was it if you were going to try to run?
Yeah, well, it was, like I said, it was a big device that was strapped to my bicep, and it had like a radio wave. So if I got too far away from the police officer, it would automatically shock me. So that's why he told me to stay close to him. I was following him around.
I'm going to just follow up with that. How did you manage to go through security with what were shackles around you, with this taser strapped to your arm? Like, what was going? I'm just imagining, you know, I'm in New York going through LaGuardia or through JFK in that form.
Well, that was part of the most embarrassing part. Was because they had their guns on them and I was strapped with a taser and shackled, we couldn't clear the metal detector. So they had to identify themselves, however it was that they did, whatever information they shared with them. And then we were escorted through the metal detectors, and that was actually, like, we rang off as we walked through. So everybody was literally staring at us.
Thank you. Alicia, this next question for you. Have there been any studies done around the psychological damage that living in, I'm using the words used here, a dog cage, quote unquote, for an entire month would inflict on someone? It would seem to be as damaging as spending time in solitary confinement. And Joe, I'll go to you next to weigh in on that, because I know that's a lot of your work.
I am not aware of any study that looks at really any aspect of prison transport academically or the effects it has on people. No.
Thank you. And maybe Victoria in your studies. But Joseph, do you want to weigh in? You do a lot of work in, like, again, solitary confinement today. You know, how might you think, I know that you didn't have that experience, like specifically in a van, but how might you think that would sort of relate?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very similar. You know, the feeling of being alone, the feeling of being stuck, the feeling of like helplessness, like the feeling of not knowing what's next. You know, the feeling it's all the exact same things. It's just in a different form. But I agree. It sounds like solitary to me.
Mm. Okay. This next question off of YouTube from Ali, to probably, I would say, probably some combination of Alicia, Eli, and even Victoria, if you want to weigh in. What happens when there is violence in a van? Like somebody was just saying that one person died due to violence, the other people riding. What happens when, you know, if there's an assault between passengers in the van? What happens? Maybe we can get your perspective, Victoria, as someone that had to deal with those, and then, you know, from one of our journalists.
Yeah, so generally the protocol when that occurred is for the officers to basically find the nearest secure location. So whatever the nearest jail was, they would have to call ahead and let them know, hey, we've got unruly passengers and we're going to need to come in to be able to take care of it. And so they could be driving for at least another hour, 2 hours, trying to find a facility that'll take them. And a lot of them, when they have to call ahead and tell them what they have going on, they don't want them to come, because that would then be a liability on the jail as to whatever happens. So they could be driving for hours with inmates fighting and nothing can be done about it.
Yeah, on the road, there's not a lot of options. Alicia, Eli, is that something that in your research that you encountered at all as to like what, you know, you found to be the common protocol when, you know, there was incidents on the vehicles themselves?
It does remind me of what happened to Stephen Gallick, which was this allegation that he was beaten by other people on board. And it speaks to this kind of gray zone that prison transportation falls into, from a law enforcement perspective and investigative perspective. when he died, the Tennessee investigators initially looked into it, but then they determined he must have died in Georgia, and they passed the investigation off to Georgia officials, who declined to take it any further than where it had gone with Tennessee. And then, of course, federal officials did not get involved. So that's just one example of an incident where someone died after allegations of a physical violence. And basically, it was so unclear who was supposed to investigate that very little investigation occurred.
Yeah, that's wild. So last question that I have here is about oversight. So I know we talked a little bit about Geno's Law and all of that, but folks are sort of asking, is there really no oversight of this industry in the way, and the comparison was made by someone in the way that a truck driver, for example, would have regulations that they need to follow. I'm not sure if Eli, you want to jump in?
Sure. So that was something else that we looked at, and Alicia, you can jump in if I'm getting off base here, because Alicia is a Department of Transportation expert. But the Federal Department of Transportation does have regulations for passenger vehicles. So, like, you know, if you're taking a bus from one city to another, there are regulations about how many people can be on that bus, and the maintenance of that bus, and how long a driver can be driving that bus. You may have been on a bus where the drivers switched at some point. That's because of federal regulations. And those do exist for passenger vans. But what some of these companies do is keep the number of people on the vehicle below a certain number, so that it doesn't, so that the regulations overseeing the large passenger vehicles like a bus don't apply to them. And we also requested records from the Department of Transportation about how often they actually audit these companies to see if they're following those rules. And we found that the audits were infrequent, only every few years at best. They often gave advance notice to the companies that they were doing an audit. And generally we had all these pages of records of the audits that they were doing, and it didn't suggest that they really exacted any consequences on these companies for when they failed to maintain their vehicles, or when they drove too many hours or anything like that. The fines were very minimal. So I guess, long story short, the Department of Transportation is supposed to regulate the industry, but it does so very sparsely.
Yeah, I would just add to that passenger carriers don't have to specify to the Transportation Department what kinds of people they are moving around. So there was no way we could get specific information about the prisoner transportation industry. In addition, they have no role in responding to the mistreatment of people aboard or escapes. Like Eli said, it's very much about the number of people and the downtime required. So it wasn't about conditions.
Right, because the rules aren't really made for that. If they're coming from the Department of Transportation, they're designed for sort of like commercial buses, trains, things of the sort that are like public modalities for transportation, not people who are being essentially transported against their will, and what that might do. So thank you. That's all we have time for today, but I want to thank all of our guests so much for joining us. Joseph De La Luz, Alicia Santo, Eli Hager, and Victoria Maxwell. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us. We'll be back next week at the same time, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, to talk about community corrections. For those of you who want to keep tonight's conversation going, to ask some questions or share your reflections, join us as we head over to Clubhouse for our public study group. Follow me at Bianca Tyler to find the room. If you'd like to learn more about or support our work at Worth Rises, please check us out at worthrises.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Worth Rises. I'm Bianca Tyler. Good night.